Let's begin this lecture with a snapshot of the state of the world on the first day of the year 1000 CE by following sunrise westwards from the international dateline. At first we see farmers and fishermen going about their business upon the forest-covered islands and deep blue surface of the Pacific. Then small groups of Australian Aboriginals foraging in the deserts and bush of that vast continent. As we sweep across Asia, we are struck first by the bustling commerce being carried on in China under the dynamic Song dynasty, and also by the vibrant activities of Muslim merchants and administrators unified under the Abbasid Caliphate. Much of the Eastern Mediterranean and Eastern Europe is also unified under a powerful agrarian civilization, that of the Byzantines, while in sub-Saharan Africa to the south, a variety of commercial and agrarian states, large and small, are flourishing. In Western Europe, however, disunity seems to be the norm. Those countries that had once been unified under the Roman Empire have dissolved into a number of feuding, medium-sized city-states. Following the sun's rays across the Atlantic to the Americas, we find many states and cultures operating in a diverse range of environments, such as the Maya, who are thriving in the steamy jungles of Mesoamerica. As the sun swept on back across the Pacific to the start of a new day, a little over 1,000 years ago, I wonder if anyone would have guessed that the next stage in the history of the world would not be driven by a wealthy Chinese dynasty or a sophisticated Islamic caliphate or a powerful Byzantine empire, all examples of the great agrarian civilizations that had been at the cutting edge of human history for the past 4,000 years. How surprised would they have been to learn that the future actually belonged to those relatively small, seemingly inconsequential West European states that were mired in constant bickering and warfare? Would they have grasped the irony that it was the very condition of disunity that was destined to give European states a crucial edge, because this forced them to come up with new solutions to problems of political and economic organization? From the collapse of Roman administration during the 5th century of the Common Era until the establishment of the European Union in the second half of the 20th century, Western Europe remained a region of divided states, similar to the very first city-states that had appeared in Samaria thousands of years earlier. Resisting all attempts to recombine, these states created instead their own individual city, regional, and eventually national destinies that drove the world across the next threshold of complexity and into the modern era. Between roughly 500 and 1750, the time frame of this lecture, wealth, markets, populations, and technologies steadily expanded in most regions of the globe. And because European societies were pre-adapted to flourish in this new environment, the position of Europe was transformed from historical backwater to new global hub. Throughout human history, we have seen how cycles of innovation and population increase stimulated the expansion of commerce, urbanization, and state power. But with an inevitability that can be quite sobering for humans in the 21st century to consider, populations always seem to grow too fast for innovation to keep up, leading to overpopulation, disease, famine, war, and sudden and often violent collapse. This pattern was noticed by 18th century economist and demographer Thomas Malthus and has come to be known as a Malthusian cycle. Let's begin by focusing on the period between roughly 500 and 1350 CE, the post-classical Malthusian cycle, characterized by the expansion of traditional agrarian civilizations into new regions of the planet and by an increase in their wealth and power. Climate change may have played a role in this expansion, in that climates were generally warmer between 800 and 1200 of the Common Era. Warmer climates meant more rainfall and increased harvests, particularly in once marginal regions at the edges of the major civilizations. These areas previously had been too cold or too dry to sustain large populations. This Malthusian upsurge lasted into the mid-14th century, when it was checked by the rapid spread of plague and perhaps also by a return to cooler climates during what is known as the Little Ice Age that lasted until about 1700. Certainly up to the year 1200, population growth stimulated urbanization and increased farming in numerous marginal regions in Eastern Europe and southern and western China. Cities multiplied and increased in size almost everywhere. In Europe, the Mediterranean basin, sub-Saharan Africa, India, Southeast Asia, and China. It wasn't just climate change driving this expansion. Human collective learning was also much in evidence, at least partly in response to climate change. The expansion of imperial civilizations in Afro-Eurasia and the Americas increased state resources, which they used to support larger and better equipped armies to facilitate even further growth. Exchange networks also expanded, leading to the colonization of regions far away from areas of dense settlement, such as in Polynesia or across Russia and the North Atlantic at the hands of the Vikings. Merchants like Marco Polo, seeking increased profits, journeyed long distances, helping further expand commerce and connecting market economies all over Afro-Eurasia. Merchants also helped spread new technologies. In a process that Linda Schaefer termed Southernization, Muslim merchants spread new crops, technologies, and ideas from Southern Asia and India in particular to the Islamic world and then on to the Mediterranean. As we've seen, these ideas included the figures we now call Arabic numerals and the Indian mathematical concept of zero. As markets expanded, many peasants were able to leave their small farms to become wage earners instead, often moving into cities, which further intensified urbanization. During this post-classical Malthusian upswing then, virtually every sector of society was affected. Rulers became more supportive of merchants, merchants became wealthy enough to join the elites, and many peasants were transformed into wage earners. So this expansion of commerce made all societies more capitalistic, but this was even more the case amongst the smaller commercial states that flourished during this period, states whose income was no longer based on old-fashioned tribute-taking, but on trade. In Europe, many of these city-states acquired the resources to begin the first wave of monumental building since the Romans. Most of the great cathedrals of Europe were built during this period. Similar developments occurred in parts of Africa, such as the Malian city of Timbuktu, which became one of the great commercial and religious centers of the Islamic world. States and city-states also invested heavily in their militaries, particularly in conflict-riven Europe. Before long, the maritime states of Venice and Genoa were strong enough to take on and often defeat much larger agrarian civilizations like the Ottoman Empire. Surprisingly, perhaps, given the great centralization that had been its hallmark, China also offers a good example of the increasing wealth and power of commercial states in this era. China's newfound strength was actually the result of an initially disastrous chain of events. Ever since the establishment of the Han Dynasty in 206 BCE, China had been one of the wealthiest tributary civilizations in the world, often united under a single ruling dynasty for long periods. These were traditional dynasties that were generally not supportive of commerce. During the Song Dynasty, however, northern China was overrun by Jurchen nomads. The Song were forced to retreat to the south, leaving China divided down the middle by a tense and contested border. Between 1127 and 1279, the Song ruled southern China only, and they were forced to come up with creative solutions to the problem of defense, solutions that led them to function more like the commercial states of Europe and Africa than a traditional agrarian civilization. Song administrators desperately sought new revenues to pay for increased defense. Commercial income was the only possibility, and with government support, Chinese ingenuity led to a burst of astonishing innovations. How's this for a list of inventions? The world's first paper money, printing using movable type, new irrigation techniques including the terracing of entire mountains and more productive strains of rice, the development of gunpowder, sophisticated silk reeling machines, and a huge increase in iron production that enabled government arsenals to produce 32,000 suits of armor a year. Many of these innovations would only appear in Europe during the Industrial Revolution 600 years later. But this surge came to an end when China was reunified by the Mongol Yuan dynasty in 1279, reverting to the mechanisms of a traditional tributary civilization. Can we imagine how different the world might look today had these innovations spread around the globe at that point in history? Perhaps a sustained industrial revolution could have started in the 13th century, and it would have been led by China, not by Europe, so that Chinese culture would dominate the world today instead of European. The Mongols were eventually replaced by the Ming Dynasty in 1368, and innovation did pick up again early on, particularly in maritime technology, allowing Chinese fleets to undertake some extraordinary voyages. The invention of the needle compass was the most important innovation of this period. It made navigation easier away from land or under cloudy skies, so it rapidly spread across the Indian Ocean, helping enormously on complex routes such as those from India to China. Shipbuilding technologies also advanced until enormous junks were being constructed, complete with stern-post rudders and watertight bulkheads. Using these technologies, the Chinese Muslim admiral Zheng He led several expeditions in the early 15th century to India, Arabia, and Africa, with a massive fleet of 317 ships and 28,000 armed men. His own flagship was enormous, with 4 decks and a length of almost 400 feet. But these expeditions were largely public relations exercises of the imperial court rather than voyages of exploration or trade, and they were eventually abandoned, not least because of their enormous cost. So China missed out on the possibility that their fleets might have discovered the Americas almost a century before Columbus. Imagine how that would have changed the course of world history. By the early 1300s, Malthusian signs of stagnation and overpopulation were appearing throughout Afro-Eurasia. Climates were also cooling and famines became more common. The Great European Famine of 1315 to 1317 killed off 15% of Europe's population. Most devastating of all disasters was the Black Death, a plague that began in the 1340s and spread from east to west across Eurasia. It killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population of many cities and towns. The Black Death, which may or may not have been the bubonic plague, spread rapidly because of the expansion of exchange networks into regions with no immunities. But it left behind survivor populations with many shared immunities, and these would later prove of tremendous significance. With the huge population losses caused by the Black Death in many parts of Afro-Eurasia, cities shrank, farmlands were abandoned, and economies contracted. Yet, as had happened so many times in the past, growth soon resumed to kickstart a new Malthusian cycle that would last well into the 18th century. It was during this early modern cycle that humans became, for the first time, a truly global species. And it was the European states that prompted the transformation by financially and militarily supporting expeditions of exploration and conquest to other regions of the world. Geography helps explain why these states' expansionist activities, which seemed relatively trivial at first, ended up having such momentous consequences, while the efforts of large empires fell short. Traditional empires like the Ming Dynasty in China were so large that they generated huge revenues simply by taxing the land, so they could afford to be unsupportive of commerce and merchants. But because European city-states were relatively small and very competitive, their rulers were more willing to support commercial activities that might generate a profit. They were only prepared to finance small-scale voyages into the Atlantic at first, but these generated just enough profit to encourage further exploration. Eventually, European mariners were able to sail clear across the Atlantic and also around the Cape of Good Hope into the Indian Ocean. They thus created, without really meaning to do so, the first genuinely global networks of exchange in human history. European merchants exploited these networks through the practice of arbitrage, buying goods cheaply in one place and selling them at a higher price somewhere else. Because of the geographical location of Europe and the Atlantic region, they were firmly located at the very center of this newly interconnected world as trade expanded and networks intensified. The Portuguese mariner Vasco da Gama led the way into the Indian Ocean and brought back a modestly profitable cargo of pepper and cinnamon. But the Portuguese had few goods of interest to rulers in the region, so instead they forced their way into the Indian Ocean trade, using their well-armed ships in a region where few ships had cannons, and also built a series of forts around the Indian Ocean. After 1600, the Dutch and British joined the Portuguese, increasing the European share of lucrative Indian Ocean trade, which brought significant wealth to Europeans and provided impetus for the creation of European empires in the region in the 17th century. Meanwhile, Spanish rulers Ferdinand and Isabella gave their backing to an expedition that hoped to reach Asia by sailing west deep into the Atlantic, headed by a Genoese sailor, Christopher Columbus. His tiny fleet reached the Bahamas on October the 12th, 1492, and Columbus believed he had reached Asia. In 1519, Ferdinand Magellan, also supported by the Spanish crown, rounded Cape Horn at the tip of South America and crossed the Pacific Ocean. Magellan was killed in the Philippines in 1521, but his deputy, Juan Sebastian Elcano, returned to Seville in 1522, thus completing the first known circumnavigation of the world. Actually, Elcano and his shipmates were not quite the first humans to do this. On board their ship was a Malay slave, Panglima Awang, who had been taken to Spain and then returned to his homeland on Magellan's fleet as an interpreter. Just as Yuri Gagarin was the first human to circumnavigate the globe in space then, Panglima Awang was the first to circumnavigate it by sea. During the 16th and 17th centuries, using brutal tactics, the Spanish and Portuguese created huge empires in the Americas, destroying the Aztec and Inca empires. In Brazil, they built new colonies where there had been no large states. The Europeans had a military edge over indigenous peoples through their use of horses and gunpowder technology. But they also had a political edge because they felt free to conquer without moral constraint, using the brutal military and political rules of Europe's constant wars. But mostly they succeeded because of the deadly weapon they brought unintentionally in the form of diseases against which people in the Americas had no immunity. This was one of the key differences produced by Europe's early participation in Silk Road's trade. Those Europeans who hadn't died of the disease that traveled by that route had immunities that people in the New World lacked. Merchants and entrepreneurs from other European countries, particularly Holland, France, and Britain, also built their own empires in the Caribbean and in North America, thus creating an entirely new zone of exchange, the Atlantic Zone. It linked the Americas into the global trading system and opened up new possibilities for arbitrage, possibilities driven particularly by Peruvian silver and economic growth in China. In the 16th century, Chinese populations began to rise fast, partly because of the introduction of American crops such as corn, sweet potatoes, and peanuts. Markets also expanded, and the Ming government began requiring that all taxes be paid in silver, creating a huge new demand for silver. At this opportune moment, the Spanish discovered a vast mountain of silver at Potosi in modern Bolivia, which they began to dig out using forced local labor and eventually slaves from Africa. Silver from Potosi was carried to Mexico, where it was minted into Spanish pesos, and also across the Atlantic, where the Spanish government spent it largely on military operations. This stream of silver flowed into the hands of European bankers and merchants, who in turn used much of it to pay for trade with the Indian Ocean, where it was also in high demand. Eventually, most of it ended up in China. Some silver from Potosi flowed directly across the Pacific in the Manila galleons, Spanish trading ships that traveled between Mexico and the Philippines. In Manila, silver was traded for Chinese silks, porcelains, and other goods, and that silver also ended up in China. Because of this chain of circumstances, Chinese demand for silver and Spanish control of cheap supplies created the world's first global financial network. The silver trade was only part of a larger process of global economic integration. In the Americas, plantations were established to exploit the resources there, beginning with sugar. The Portuguese established sugar plantations and worked them using African slave labor, and before long the Dutch, British, and French had done something similar in the Caribbean. These plantations helped transform environments throughout the world. Colonizers cleared native vegetation to create farms and moved species into environments they had never occupied before, helping humans gain increasing control over the resources of the planet. The African slave trade supplied the labor needed to do all this, and eventually the plantation system was expanded to grow tobacco and cotton. As the demand for products and slaves intensified, the system became increasingly brutal. Many other consequences followed the creation of the first global networks of exchange, such as the movement of crops, animals, and pathogens between the world zones. These exchanges between the old world and the new became known as the Columbian Exchange. Sheep, cattle, pigs, and goats reached the Americas for the first time, and horses that had been hunted to extinction there in the Paleolithic era also returned on Spanish galleons, helping to create the horse riding cultures of the Plains Indians. The effect of this reconnection of continents that had been separated by oceans for millennia was profoundly felt by populations all over the world zones, but with very different consequences. In Afro-Eurasia, the introduction of American crops like maize, tomatoes, potatoes, manioc, tobacco, and chocolate increased farm yields, and as a consequence, populations and commerce grew. But in the Americas, it was a disaster. Contact with Afro-Eurasian diseases like smallpox, measles, influenza, and typhus led to catastrophic epidemics that depopulated large areas of the Americas, and eventually also Australasia and the Pacific region, which of course made it easier for European colonizers to import their own crops, people, state structures, and farming methods. These may have been the cruelest epidemics in human history, with population losses in the Andes of 70% and in Mesoamerica, perhaps 90%. The new global linkage also impacted the intellectual world of Europe, as new information from all around the globe flowed into European cities. The discovery of new worlds like the Americas, the sighting of new Southern Hemisphere stars, and the discovery of peoples and cultures and religions never known before and not mentioned in the Bible led to growing skepticism about traditional forms of knowledge and attempts to assemble information more firmly based on empirical evidence and reason. The English philosopher Francis Bacon saw the geographical discoveries of this time as a model of how science itself should proceed, not through the study of ancient or religious texts, but by the exploration of the real world. The Italian Renaissance scientist, astronomer, and inventor Galileo Galilei also articulated a genuinely empirical view of knowledge, which needed to be tested by careful observation. He invented a series of telescopes which he used to study the solar system, discovering craters on the moon and moons orbiting Jupiter. In so doing, he confirmed the view of Nicholas Copernicus that the Earth was one of several planets that revolved around the sun. Because of this heresy, he was put under house arrest by church authorities and died in captivity. Born in 1642, the same year that Galileo died, English physicist and mathematician Isaac Newton argued that the laws of gravity, which he had discovered, would apply in space as they did on Earth. Although this was not proven until after his death, Newton believed that even here on our tiny planet, it should be possible to develop a plausible understanding of how the universe itself functioned. Both the skepticism generated by new knowledge and the conviction that knowledge should be sought in empiricism drove Europe towards the scientific revolution that exploded in the 17th century. At the same time as European societies grew wealthier from commerce and plunder, wars between them also intensified. These conflicts led to the development of new military technologies based on gunpowder, which had been invented by the Chinese centuries earlier. The power of these states grew as a result, even though they were still utterly dwarfed by the enormous traditional agrarian civilizations such as the Qing dynasty in China. We used to think that the creation of the global networks of the 16th century was only made possible because of clever European innovations in navigation, shipbuilding, and military technology. But actually, there were very few fundamental innovations in this period. Portuguese mariners sailing the Atlantic did begin to use ships known as caravels that had triangular sails, which allowed them to sail closer to the wind. Eventually, on larger ships, they combined triangular and square sails. But these were not so much innovations as adaptations of older technologies to new contexts. In the Indian Ocean, Arab mariners had been using similar sails for centuries. And as we've seen, the Lapita peoples who populated the Pacific invented their own triangular sails as early as 3,500 years ago. Adaptation to local conditions was actually more important than revolutionary innovations in this period. For example, the use of cannons on ships was widespread throughout the Indian Ocean when the Portuguese arrived. But the Mameluke and Ottoman practice of mounting cannons at the bows of their galleys could not match the coordinated cannon fire made possible by the Portuguese adaptation of mounting their cannon along the sides of their ships. European governments also adapted bureaucratic practices that had been ongoing in the world's successful agrarian civilizations for millennia, like the recruitment of officials based on their expertise. Even business practices, such as establishing new partnerships that led to the creation of the Dutch and British East India Companies, were really adaptations of much older Muslim mechanisms of doing business. But what was really new was the massive size and range of the activities of these new business partnerships, as well as their significant private military power. The British and Dutch East India Companies essentially established the template for all modern multinational companies. By the year 1700, the Dutch East India Company was the richest private company the world had ever seen, with over 50,000 employees and a substantial private army and navy. Something similar happened with the European adaptation of printing technology. The Chinese had been using movable type printing for many centuries before the printer Johannes Gutenberg began using metal movable type in 1453. Printing with movable metal type was actually invented in Korea, although the technique worked better with simple alphabetic scripts that only needed a small number of characters. Gutenberg's contribution took printing and with it European society to an entirely new level of advancement. The expansion of printing in Europe stimulated literacy and sped up the circulation of information and intellectual discourse at a critical moment that paralleled the Renaissance. By 1500, 20 million books had been printed, and by 1600, at least 200 million books had been printed. In spite of all these remarkable developments, many aspects of life in Europe and around the world remained unchanged as late as 1750. The speed of transportation and communication remained as slow as it had been for thousands of years, with goods carried by horse-drawn wagons or by riverboats driven by the wind or dragged along by hand. Most humans on the planet were still peasants, growing their own food and making their own clothes and other necessary goods. And much of the world was still living in rural settings. Most of the world's cities and towns still housed only a small minority of the population, perhaps 10 to 20%, about the same as in the earliest agrarian civilizations. But all this was about to change rapidly. Markets were beginning to deeply transform society and change how governments worked, and even how most people earned a living. These changes would become most apparent first in Europe, where the effects of the intensification of commercial, economic, and political activities around the world were most obvious. By 1800, everything was about commerce. How familiar does that sound to humans living in the 21st century? Commerce was all that merchants, bankers, and governments cared about. The foundations were laid for the imminent takeover of the entire world by capitalism. Already in 1700, most of the income of the British government came from customs and business taxes. So it was hardly surprising that the government was so supportive of trade through their huge navy and the founding of the Bank of England. This meant that the very structure of British society was also changing because more and more people were involved in market exchanges. By the end of the 17th century, 50% of England's rural population had been driven from their small farms by a series of enclosure acts. The only option they had was to sell their labour, either in the countryside, working as rural labourers for large farmers, or by heading for the towns and cities. All the political, social, cultural, and economic conditions were thus in place at the end of the early modern cycle for the next revolution in human history to occur, which would be ignited by the burning of coal. The world was primed for the astonishing burst of genuine innovation known as the Industrial Revolution, and that revolution would usher in the age of modernity.